Hey guys, it's me, Kenneth. We're going to be painting this guy today, a champion of Tzeentch back from the realm of chaos in the 90s. So for this particular miniature, I've gone ahead to do up the base already, just because I wanted to spare showing you that every single time I do these videos. It's a fairly simple process. It's just agarose dunes over some sand, and on the edge it's brown leather by AK. So let's move on to blocking in his coat. This is Imperial Fists Yellow, which is a nice kind of medium yellow. I think it manages to get, a very subtle kind of shade going, in addition to the fact that it's just a really nice bright yellow. Putting this all over his robes essentially gives us a really good base to work off. And eventually we will be shading this down further with a little bit of Eanden yellow, just to provide a little bit more punch in the recesses. So I hope you had a great weekend. It's Monday over here in Singapore, and this should be a really good way to start your week with someone quite iconic. This particular champion of Tzeentch has appeared in a great many old Citadel publications. I think because he's got a really strong and effective pose, and he has got this real sense of conveying just what the Great Deceiver is all about. Tzeentch is the god of magic and manipulation, and this guy, with his extremely, static pose, but really conveying the sense that he is in control of the situation. He's got all the right visual cues to convey that kind of dangerous, yet, really powerful manipulative tendencies. So yeah, I'm gonna just block this in Imperial Yellow, Imperial Fists Yellow, and it goes over all of the yellow areas in more or less an even coat, not worrying too much about the contrast effect, because this particular contrast paint, I believe, has very little of that going on anyway. So the idea is to just get a basic neat coat over all of this quickly, and then we can move on to more interesting colors to sort of contrast this. So Tzeentch is one of the most interesting chaos gods, right? Insofar as he's an entity that kind of doesn't favor direct physical combat, more interested in manipulating things behind the scenes. And a kind of mastery of magic is also referenced in the fact that most of his minions are actually sorcerers or else acolytes of some description of the magical arts. So this miniature, he's armed with nothing but a staff, and I think that's a real statement to make. He has no secondary weapon. He's just sort of standing there, in this position of rest with this expression, this really pacific expression on his face, like he's just waiting for you to come to try something against him. It's little touches like this that kind of really make Tzeentch miniatures really fascinating to paint, in my opinion, because they're about as far as you can get from the warlike aspects that you often see in Cornate miniatures, or just the sheer wicky claw with like spiky claws and whippy tentacles that you get for Sinestri miniatures or Nurgle ones. Those ones actually look outright dangerous. Tzeentch, well, the danger that he poses is a little bit more subtle in that sense. So I like these models mostly because they have more of a power pose going on. Most of the Tzeentch characters tend to not be brandishing weapons in a very aggressive way. They just kind of seem to be standing there, being there just as a really disturbing presence. And on the subject of disturbing, there are lots of little details about this miniature that I really like. So, for example, he's got too many feet, right? He's got one, two, three going on, and they're all bedecked in different ways. One foot is armored, it appears. Another one just has a fabric shoe. Well, those two are fabric shoes. That's an armored foot. So again, you get this idea of asymmetry and that slightly disturbing kind of look about him. He's got armor, but in only sections on his body. It's got a little bit of skin showing, so that's a really interesting opportunity to paint it in an interesting way. We'll have a think about what we want to do exactly about that. And the other major thing I want to bring across with this miniature is just how bright and vibrant Tzeentch champions can get. It'll really look good in this interesting bright color scheme. So it's going to be a combination of yellow, magenta, and blue, and that's a reference to the pink fire of Tzeentch, the blue fire of Tzeentch, and just the idea that yellow, it's a popular accent color on Tzeentch miniatures, and I think he will look really good in those. So I'm going to drop this. This is Sigvald Burgundy, and I'm going to just pop this on this sash that he's got going down the side, being careful not to get too much of it onto the yellow. but then at the same time being not too worried if we happen to get a little bit on the yellow. I decided to do the base first because I don't think there's a real benefit to you watching me do the base every single week. It's not exactly rocket science, and it's usually done very quickly anyway. So this maybe gives me a little bit more time to try to get, the additional bits of detail that I want on these miniatures. I mean, goodness knows these videos take me long enough already as it is. Don't need to make you sit through that extra little bit every single week. So putting in the magenta, you can sort of see how it's got that really interesting crossover with the yellow already. It's kind of creating lots of visual contrast, and we can come into, like juice up that burgundy a little bit later with a choice highlight or two. I'm going to do the inside of his hood because that really allows us to emphasize the area of his face. And I've been having a bit of a think about how I want to do his face, to be honest. On the one hand, I suspect with how little I'm going to be using blue on the miniature, which is another one of those like traditional blue colors, right? Because there's a pink fire and the blue fire of Tzeentch, which are just spells that are really iconic to this edition of Warhammer Fantasy. I kind of want to incorporate a bit of blue and yellow into the color scheme, but also a bit of the burgundy. So trying to find a place for that blue to reside, it's kind of key. And more than likely, I'm going to do his face in blue. But instead of using a bright primary blue like Thalasar blue, I'm going to go ahead and use something like Gryph Charger gray, just because I think that makes it a little bit more subtle and a little bit closer to the idea of the way Flesh looks. That probably will be the way to do it. He's got a cowl. That part will probably be blue. So the outside of his cowl, I might do that in blue. The one that's sort of like continuous with the mantle that's going around his neck. Yeah. So there's another little area that I want to do in burgundy, and that's this ribbed section over there on his staff. I imagine this is a bit of a handle, so it gives us a bit of relief from the constant gold that will be running up and down the staff. Another option, perhaps, is to not do it in gold, but to maybe do it in maybe I might do it in silver and then wash it over in blue. That's one way that we can sort of get a little bit more interesting colors in. That might be the move. Yeah, probably. As for his shoes, likewise, bedroom slippers. So I like the fact that he's got three different feet. Let's just do this one in burgundy as well. This pair, and then that just keeps it really interesting with the other foot, which I think I would do in metal washed in blue as well. I think that's beginning to sound better and better as an idea to me. As you can see, for most of these videos, I just make up color schemes as I go along, simply because this series is all about reconnecting with that joy of just painting loosely, and just kind of creating things as we go along, reveling in that joy of creation, which is very, very Tzeentch when you think about it, because Tzeentch is also the god of mutation. Tzeentch does like some overt mutations on his models, and I like the idea that even though many of his followers are just covered in weird little creepy mutations, I like the idea that Tzeentch also kind of, even though there's a lot of mutations on it, they don't really wear them outright. They're kind of worked into the miniatures quite subtly, at least in the case of this guy. I mean, there are some others where they're just brandishing their funny little like pink horror hands and heads on chests and bird heads and all sorts of weird stuff, like quite out there in the open. But for this guy, he's holding his mutations quite subtly. I say that, and then of course there's a giant pair of horns sprouting directly out of his head. But there is also like room to explore the idea that maybe that's not his face. Maybe that's just a kind of mask that he's wearing over his features. Maybe beneath that mask he's so mutated that to do so would really upset anyone who like catches sight of it. Because that's another aspect of Tzeentch, right? The idea that he's a little bit more of a communal god as well, insofar as he delights in getting mortal followers to deceive and to manipulate. Therefore, a Tzeentch character does need to look overtly powerful to manipulate the masses as well. So, with that in mind, It might be that they don't wear their mutations right out in the open so much. Maybe they hide them because they might be inconvenient. There are a lot of like witch hunters like moving around the empire, of course, at all times, and it wouldn't do well to attract the wrong crowd too early in your process of trying to mess around with the population of an imperial city. So, with that in mind, I think the idea that his feet are just bedecked in these like regular kind of bedroom slippers, I find that kind of amusing, and the fact that his outfit is more or less fairly par for the course for any magic user. The only thing is that if you look a little bit too closely, you might find that he has got a few too many feet. Well, one too many foot anyway. And his giant horns on his face, there is an option for doing that as, just like a ceremonial mask or something. I will mull on this. Depending on what the balance of colors on this miniature ends up to be, I might or might not do that as a metal mask. But for now, at least, I'm leaning more towards the idea of doing it as a flesh tone or some variation of a flesh tone. Mostly because also he's got a little piece of he's got a little bit of his elbow showing over here. And I like the idea that I want to connect the two areas together. Make it so that his face matches his elbow, just for a little bit of that visual continuity that's really important for us when we're trying to visually understand the look of a miniature. So with that in mind, I'm going to do that little medallion over there in silver as well, but for now it's a little bit too close to that wet spot, so let's not do that. Let's jump right in and start shading some of his yellow, shall we? So for this, I'm going to use Eandon yellow, which is a really great yellow that's a little bit closer to the orange spectrum. So that's what it looks like over there on the top. The lighter yellow patch is the Imperial Fist, of course, from before. And this stuff, I think, really gets across some of the richness of tone to really make that yellow pop up. Yeah, I think I like the way that looks. And to this, of course, we finish probably with using a bit of Vallejo Ice Yellow to do the additional highlight. Now, another benefit of getting the base done off camera is so that I get to spend a little bit more time on these videos, getting the finish to a slightly higher finish level, because there have been areas that I've been avoiding painting simply because I don't have enough time on these videos to get them done. That's because I still want to have these models done within a reasonable time frame. I think they're long enough as it is, and hopefully that lets me drop in an additional highlight or two to just get them to where I want them to be. For all of you joining me regularly on these videos, thanks a lot. Your support has been really, really important to my ability to get these videos done. And as always, I hope you let me know exactly which miniatures were bucket list miniatures for you from back in the day. Let me know so that I can get them ready and maybe get to painting them on the channel. If I have them in my collection, I'll definitely try to get them ready for painting on one of these episodes, because these have been incredibly fun to paint and really satisfying to get done. Okay. Along with this, I have plans to do slightly longer videos. Well, not longer, but long-running series of videos where I tackle some of the more complex miniatures of this time. So things like I have a Chaos Dwarf Earthshaker cannon, for example, lined up ready to go. And I've mentioned Nagash in one of my previous videos as well. He's definitely on the planning stage, and definitely something that a model that is 100% on my own personal bucket list, and hopefully on the bucket list of some of you guys as well, because that's such a great model, and unfairly gets a lot of hate for being a little bit over designed. Now, I fully acknowledge that model is a little bit over designed, a little bit over the top, but kind of cool in its own way, and definitely a product of his time, which is why he lands for me the way he does. Sometimes your appreciation of a model really comes down to when it was released. Was it released at a time when you were just kind of in the right mood to be receptive towards something like that? Maybe it was particularly seminal. Maybe you saw it in the pages of White Dwarf as a kid growing up. And they became really, really significant to you because they represented that era in your mind. That's definitely how I feel about Nagash and how I feel about the zombie dragon, the undead zombie dragon. Now that's a bucket list miniature if ever there was one for me personally. I might be trying to get my hands on one of those simply because, well, I've always wanted one but never really got round to it. Okay, so let's drop in and do that blue cowl. So for this, we'll be using Telesar blue. This is a nice dark primary blue that has a lot of intensity. Nothing, nothing too subtle about him. Sorry. Hope you're okay. Nothing too subtle about this, and yet really, vibrant and unmissable. So blue and yellow were always going to be major components of this color scheme, right? Because they're so essential to the look and feel of Zinj. So finding a home for these two colors was always going to be a major part of planning out this color scheme, such as I do. And I really like the way these colors create extreme contrast on the surface of the miniature. In other words, this guy is bright, he's colorful, he doesn't care if he gets spotted. And that's part of getting into the allure of this miniature, because that kind of really confident pose and just a really bold color scheme kind of really work together to convey the personality of the miniature. This guy is essentially the CEO of a Zinj company or something, and he's not afraid to let anyone spot him on the battlefield, which says a lot, right? I mean, there are cannons and all sorts of dangerous things out there looking to hunt individual characters like this. And this guy's whole demeanor shows that he's kind of up for it. Doesn't really care if he gets spotted. He's that confident in his ability to mitigate harm and to subsequently sort you out, that he's quite willing to stand there like a boss. Love it. So he's also got these little pouches carrying all sorts of magical unmentionables, no doubt. I'll drop the blue in there just to make sure that we have multiple points on the same miniature in that blue color, and just to visually have that, sort of almost like a cross going across the front of the miniature. And that really helps us visually build that form in our minds to make it really memorable. So there we go. Now that's moving right along at a fair clip. That's great. We're only 18 minutes in, and as you can see, that's already kind of got lots going on. Nice clean yellow. The front could be cleaner, admittedly. Needs a bit of a touch up, but for now, let's move on to doing that flesh. Now, talked about doing the flesh as a mask of some kind. I think in the end, let's give that Gryph Charger Grey a shot. So he's got, he's kind of pseudo-human on some level, although he is actively mutating into something else. So let's give that a try. See how it looks. So far it's looking a bit gray on his skin. It's not a bad look, but I can see that this model could benefit from some strong highlights in order to create that bit of separation from the various parts. It's a bit of a hand underneath that gauntlet on the left side, and kind of looking forward to when we get to shade the metal so that it doesn't look quite so artificial. Let's see what it looks like on his face. That's not too bad. And then the horns, probably I won't go for a natural looking horn color. Probably not. more than likely I'll do that in black, because I think when you keep it dark and dynamic looking, it kind of looks a little bit more sinister, which is very in line with, the whole idea of this guy being a manipulator, a bit of a disturbing presence to be physically near, a magus as he were. In fact, this model has a lot of similarities with the Gene Stealer Magi, right? They kind of have, they share elements of the design, which I kind of like, the power pose, the robes, and just the general demeanor of this unnerving placidity. He looks kind of calm and at ease, which makes him all the more upsetting to look at. Because when the bad guys are calm and at ease, they look that much more unnerving, don't they? Yeah, so I'm going to wash out my brush. I'm going to jump back in with a little bit more silver to catch that medallion that I missed out over here. And then the next question is, which bits do I want to do in gold and which do I want to do in my blue glazed over metallic blue look? I'm going to be playing by ear a little bit, because I can sort of see a case for it being made on most of the surfaces. I think the armor bits should be blue, mostly because those tend to adjoin the yellow cloth bits and could do with a little bit more definition. Speaking of which, I mentioned wanting to clean up the cloth slightly with a little bit more Iandan yellow, so I'm going to drop that. Ooh, that's the wrong color. What happened there? No matter. Just a little bit of water and a quick wipe with your brush, and you can get most of these things off. So I'm not sure where I picked up a bit of blue over there, but you know what? Disaster averted. Let's move on. So dropping in a little bit more of this orangey Iandan yellow, and then very soon it will be time to maybe put on our first highlight, so get that look starting to be a little bit more three-dimensional. Yeah, that looks good. Okay. All right, cool. So I think he's coming along nicely. It's time maybe to give his clothing or his metal bits a wash. So let's start with doing his armor in what's a good color? We're going to try Tyrant Blue, which is this stuff, which is a color that I don't think I've used before. It's a bit more of an indigo looking blue. It's a good fit for it's a good match for the Telesar blue. They kind of look kind of nice side by side, but I think this adds a little bit more interest. So let's see how that looks. Right, that looks good. So Tyrant Blue is a shade, right? So intensity wise, it's going to be still very translucent, and in addition a bit weaker to contrast paint when compared to contrast paint, and I think that gives us a really interesting effect over that metal shoe. Let's do his forearms as well, because there is already a lot of yellow, and from afar, to be honest, yellow kind of gold kind of reads as yellow from afar, so maybe let's be a bit judicious about how we use that. Use it only where it matters, essentially. This little bracelet. He's gone over here, and you just know with a Zinj guy, everything is magical, right? All his equipment is probably enchanted in some small way, or else by association with being so close to such a magical creature that it's kind of picked up some of his weirdness. And I like that idea. Zinj models, I think, always had a bit of flair. They were a little bit different from the usual Chaos Worshipper. I mean, they had a bit more subtlety, a little bit more, akin to the whole Cthulhu kind of vibe, and that made them very interesting models visually as well as conceptually on the battlefield. They were all about taking over the minds of others, turning other people into demons, that kind of thing. Demons as in DAE, demons, which were the weird alien creatures that live in the alternate reality universe. I mean, this is all very Michael Moorcock, right? Like Games Workshop freely borrows from Michael Moorcock. Borrows being a bit generous because a lot of it is just almost straight up taken out of it, and that's why we love it, because it presented just a very different view of the material universe, crossing over with the fantasy realm and therefore adding that extra dimensional element. In a way, it's not unlike how things are with Ghostbusters, right? You know, if it weren't for the fact that you had Gozer the Traveler, at the end of the day, the Ghostbusters would just be busting ghosts all day. And, you know, interesting as that may be, it would not have had the escalation that brought that movie to a satisfying conclusion. So the fact that the realm of chaos ultimately had, you know, material interests, like creatures from that realm kept popping into our universe to kind of be difficult about things, really added that sense of having an ultimate enemy, you know, just being at play in our realm, and therefore provided the ultimate threat. I think the way Games Workshop narratives today kind of downplays the idea of chaos, and you know, the question is, well, in what way? Because chaos is everywhere in the current stories, but they are coming across a lot more like Saturday morning cartoon villains than malign entities that are a little bit unknown and a bit, you know, disturbing. Like in this era of like Rogue Trader, you know, as well as early Warhammer, frankly, the idea of chaos wasn't quite understood still. So that kind of amorphous lack of form added a lot to the mystery associated with them. And therefore, as a result, they just didn't seem quite as defeatable. At this point, the greater and lesser minions of the different Chaos patrons was already fleshed out, but a lot of their lore and background was still, you know, in flux. And meeting a Bloodthirster was still a serious problem insofar as it's world-ending stuff, right? Because these guys would carve their way through almost anything the good guys could hurl at them, and that was really appealing to me. Just that sense of, you know, apocalyptic doom that would presage the appearance of these models into the battlefield. That really made it look like, you know, all the chips are, all your cards are down. You're kind of up against the wall, and it's one heck of a serious effort to try to get things back on track, or else, you know, the world will be plunged into darkness. It felt like these were really serious entities when they showed up, instead of just a run-of-the-mill villains that they appear to be now when they show up in the stories. You know, at this point, once you had factions like, you know, the Grey Knights, which, you know, were already demon hunting entities in the past, demon hunting like Space Marines in the past, for example, in the 40k universe. But I think because they didn't go into so much detail about it, they kept, you know, their methods, and they kept their progress, and basically also their chances of success, their odds of success. They kept them in the dark. You know, we were allowed to kind of fill in the blanks a little bit with our imaginations, as opposed to having some really bad stories written about how effective they were. I think that kind of downplays the major threat that chaos is supposed to pose. Unfortunately, diminishes the threat, and therefore lowers the stakes in not the best way. But that's just me, you know, grouchy old grognard complaining about the way things used to be. But, you know, such as it is, I suppose. I do like my chaos. I do like the idea that it should be the ultimate threat, because the realm of chaos is boundless, right? Like even the idea that for example, the myriad forces of the Tyranids, even though they were an extra galactic threat and therefore potentially boundless, or just the idea that there were endless numbers of orcs, or, you know, the Under Empire of the Skaven for the Warhammer Fantasy setting, even though these all seem very limitless and very powerful, the idea that you had an entire extra dimension out there with chaos in all its multivarious forms, that felt truly boundless and limitless, and therefore the threat posed by them likewise felt boundless and limitless as well. And that made for a really interesting enemy, so to speak. And the strength of a fantasy or non-fiction setting is really determined by the adversaries, right? Not so much by the heroes that live within it. To be honest, even though we foreground the heroes, I think much of what makes an enemy's a setting really compelling is how serious the threat is, and then therefore within that milieu we get to appreciate the actions of our foregrounded heroes. And in that sense, I think the idea that lately Games Workshop has been downplaying the potency of chaos doesn't really sit right with me, because it diminishes the threat and makes it feel like, yeah, maybe the Warhammer world will be just fine, maybe the 40k setting is going to be just okay, and everything will turn out all right, because that's not the vibe of the early stuff, and therefore maybe that's why I'm drawn to the early stuff as strongly as I am. Yeah. Anyway, back to this guy. Highlights in yellow. I think he's looking pretty good. Got a bit on that burgundy, but I'll fix that shortly. And he's looking to be a smart boy. So this is ice yellow. I think dawn yellow is the close equivalent for the Citadel range if you decide to stick to the Citadel range. And I think it's a really good mix to get that yellow to pop, especially after Phalanx yellow. Now, a lot of people might be tempted to mix white into yellows to get lighter yellows. I think depending on the kind of color you're using, this may or may not be true. So if you've got a nice kind of chrome yellow, I suppose, adding white to it might make it brighter without desaturating it too much. But I think a lot of the yellows, and this is just a problem with yellow pigment in general, right? It tends to not have the intensity to pop when you add too much white to lighten it. So I am a fan of ice yellow. Also good from an army painting standpoint, because if you use yellow, ice yellow, or dawn yellow as the case may be, if you're sticking to strictly Citadel paints, I think it's a good idea to kind of make sure that your endpoint for all of your miniatures is the same, so that you don't highlight your miniatures with greater or lesser amounts of zeal depending on what stage you are in the painting process. Keeping the end stage for all your highlights consistent kind of makes a big difference to the final look of the army, and can make it can be a real game changer for the look of the miniatures as a whole, simply because they all start and end at the same point. I'm going to drop in some Black Templar on his horns now, and then we're going to move on to doing his medallions and his staff handle in gold. I think that will give us the nice mix of colors that we want. So let's do his horns. He's got some striations on his horns, so I think we'll be picking that out as well if we can. So sometimes, the more outstanding, the more dramatic a mutation is, you could either lean into it and just make it really bright and crazy so that it's really eye-catching, or you can sort of downplay it slightly. And on this model, with his outfit already looking as ridiculously bright and colorful as it is, it makes sense to downplay the mutations a little bit so that it doesn't get too okay, a bit more black just to finish his horns on this side, and block that in towards the center. Sometimes it helps as well to, when you've got parts of the model that kind of break the silhouette in a way that kind of confuses the look of the model from afar, it can help to do those areas subtle rather than put too much attention to them, because that makes it a bit confusing to look at. So that's why I have a tendency to want to go darker on these. You kind of play them a bit subtle and close to the chest rather than, kind of go the whole hog into it. So I'm going to be darkening the inside of his sleeves simply because I think that looks better, makes more sense of the shape. Very carefully. And then a little bit more black Templar on this side as well to fill in the wells of his sleeves, make them look dark and ominous and voluminous. I mean, who knows what manner of stuff he might be hiding in there. I think that's kind of a cool idea. A little bit of black around the lower part of his cowl. And we're going to be coming in to touch up some of the areas that we missed a bit later on. So let's drop in a bit more blue. I believe, yep, that's a place I missed. And a bit more of the burgundy to touch up around this area. Also to fill in that little bit of the belt that I missed earlier within up here in the recess of that space next to his staff. And then I believe it's time to pop in some of the gold, and we then finally have the ability to maybe assess where the color scheme is going. So my usual gold mix, as I've mentioned time and time again, it's a mix of Nazdreg yellow and Seraphim Sepia. I find this gives me that nice kind of gold that's not too yellow. Nazdreg yellow on its own can be a bit too yellow, as the name suggests, with a bit of the mellowness of Seraphim Sepia. This, I think, makes it just the right blend for gold. And yeah, letting it build up a little bit where it comes into contact with the yellow might be a good way to make sure that it stands out sufficiently, that it doesn't kind of blend into the yellow, so to speak. Let's put some of that here, on the other side as well, and have this run down all the way. He's got a couple of gemstones on this that we will pick up in another color later on. But yeah, for the most part, I think now we just want to make sure that we get an even coat of this wash onto the gold to achieve that look quickly and easily. A little bit of manipulation of the color on the surface just to make sure that it's building up where you want it to build up and not just everywhere. And I think that's looking pretty decent. Just wick away a little bit of that excess. And it's okay if some of this gold mix actually gets into the yellow of the robes, because gold and yellow are so close anyway that frankly it doesn't really hurt the model too much. If it happens, you just want to stop it from happening excessively, because that might make the colors blend together a little bit too much. Yeah, so I think that's what I'm happy with. That amount I'm happy with, and then maybe we can spend a little bit of time fixing his flesh. Before we do that, let's do a little bit more Tyrant Blue where it's needed to define the undersides, the little crevices that we missed earlier, or that we have yet to reach rather. Sometimes we reframe the negative thoughts of having missed things or having made mistakes and go down the route of reframing them as happy little accidents. I am, of course, a fan of a certain poofy hat painter. You know the one. So, a bit more Tyrant Blue around his hands. And I think that's looking pretty good. So now let's jump on over to defining his face a little bit, because I think as much as I like the look of Gryphcharger Grey, I think it does tend to be a little bit weak, especially when put next to all these really bright colors. So I'm going to grab some of my silver grey. That's the Vallejo silver grey that I use as a complement to my undercoat. So whenever I need to touch up the surface of the model back to the level of my undercoat. I use this stuff, Leo Silver Gray. It's a nice desaturated gray, and it allows us to really define his face a little bit. So a lot of these models have the look of like, I mean, he looks like Ernie, right? No, he looks like Bert from Sesame Street. So it's best to work through it in sections, starting with the T-zone, the nose, and the eyebrow ridge, and then the cheeks, and then after that, his lips, or the top of the mouth, the other cheek, and then define a bit of his chin and lower lip. And it's okay at this stage if we go a little bit harsh, because we'll be coming back in with a little bit more Gryph Charger to blend them together again. And then the dome of his forehead. Sorry, I hope you can see that. Dome of his forehead. So yeah, the T-zone, as I mentioned earlier, just in case I did it off camera, I'm sorry. T-zone, cheeks, upper lip, lower lip, and chin. And you really want to be leaving just a very small amount of black within his mouth, actually, because it's not that large of an area in real life, much less so on a tiny little miniature like this. So blend in top of the head, feathering it with a little bit of moisture. I like to use a wet tissue or the wet palette sometimes to pick up a bit of extra moisture to get that blend going. And then do the top of his head that way. Hopefully those horns aren't blocking you. And there we go. So likewise, a bit of his hands. So this silver gray is, in my opinion, it's to Gryph Charger gray what the ice yellow is to yellow in general, right? I like to use it as the apex color for Gryph Charger gray because I think it gives all the right notes. And you notice that at this point we've covered the vast majority of the Gryph Charger gray as before with this tone, and that's quite intentional because I think I'm going to come back in and I'm going to detail. I'm going to sort of like blend it back together again with a bit of Gryph Charger gray. So I think that's looking all right. I hope that's been visible to you. And because that needs a little bit of time to dry, I think once I'm done establishing the silver gray, I might move on to another area, and we can come back to that a little bit later on, because sometimes it's not a good idea to rush these things, especially if you're trying to do the whole video in one take. Okay, so a little bit more of the Eandon yellow to deepen the recesses. And this is the painter's dance, right? This is the back and forth that we do with shades as well as highlights to establish smooth blends. We go back and forth between these. We cut into our highlights with more shading, and then after that we brighten up the shading with more highlights, back and forth until we achieve smooth blends on our miniature. And this can be just a very pleasing kind of back and forth. I really enjoyed this. It's very meditative, not at all stressful. And the idea is that eventually you'll get it right. You just need to keep at it and be patient, and you'll get a model that you'll be proud of in the end. So that little sojourn into the yellow realm means that we have time to go. That it's time to go back into Gryph Charger gray, and as you can see, Gryph Charger gray when applied just gently over the surface like this it's quite subtle, and it's perfect for making sure that these highlights don't run away with the model and make it too vibrant. Cut away some of these highlights, reduce the surface area that they cover, and help them blend into the overall look of the miniature to make sure that they're not too harsh, not too vibrant, and helping them look a natural part of the miniature. Okay, so that's looking pretty good, I feel. Let's jump right in and add some highlights to those horns because they're looking a little bit dark and nondescript, slightly messy. So a little bit of silver gray mixed into the Black Templar gives us a nice highlight. Let's drop some of this in. Okay. And a bit more on the other side. So it's okay to be a bit rough with these highlights because we're going to come in and we're going to tone them down again slightly. I mean, bonus points if you get them perfect on the first pass, but sometimes that's a little bit hard to do. And sometimes that's a level of, perfection that we don't need to aspire to necessarily, because a little bit of cleaning up goes a long way to making it look just right. Okay, so there we go. Suitably menacing. Let's continue that around the side. So there's a bit of continuity with the striations on the front. And a little bit more on this side as well. So usually what we want to do is we want to try to draw a distinction between the actual texture that we're painting on, in this case the striations on his horns, and kind of the gradual fade that we want to have to the point that it connects to his head. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is we're going to come back in with Black Templar very gently and kind of feather it in. And we know wherever the highlights have become a little bit too thick, you can come in and touch that up with this stuff in order to make sure that they blend nicely. There you go. So this is a really good way to achieve that kind of middle ground between having a really complex effect that takes forever to achieve and one that just looks good from arm's length. Basically the difference between an individual fade kind of look where you just sort of fade the entire horn into his head and you sort of blend that together with that little bit of hyper detail on the edge of the horns. So basically the idea is that so long as you treat the texture as a different kind of shading from that of that blend with the base of the horns, you have something that's visually interesting however you look at it. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Makes sense to me. And I think that's looking pretty decent. I want to just put a little bit of our silver gray onto the points of these gems in preparation for the color that we'll be putting over them later. And then we can go on to mixing this into the burgundy to start creating some highlights. To just draw a bit of attention to the tips of his shoes and what shoes they are. A bit more silver gray. I must say, from the back, it looks almost kimono-like, with the way I've picked out this sash in burgundy. Let's work on that shoe. Bring out these striations. Work a bit of this onto the tassels at the bottom. And I can see that we're going to need to blend that in because that's really harsh, but it's okay for now. It's a start point. I'm gonna move this a bit. Sorry that made you want to throw up slightly. Won't happen again, I hope. So again, this is a stage where we address the texture. Lots of little brush strokes. And then we come back in again with the glaze of contrast paint to make sure that they blend seamlessly into the model, while taking the opportunity to clean up some of the highlights as well. A little bit on the sash. And on the striations of his staff, you just need to go down the center line. Okay, make sure these are the right shape before we cut back in with the burgundy once more. So a series of lines on most of these surfaces, and we're beginning to see the effect that it's having on the areas and how we perceive the light and dark zones. So now we're going to grab some raw burgundy once more, apply it over. It's a bit strong, so we can take some of it off. Make sure that we cut into the highlights accordingly, help them blend in, and make sure that they do not go overboard. There we go. Now we go back to our highlight that we mixed earlier, and you get the idea, right? So this is the back and forth that I was mentioning. Do not be, I guess, discouraged if your highlights are a little bit too chunky at first. It's going to be really easy to come back in and touch it up as needed. And it's really about how many times you choose to go back and forth to get it looking exactly the way you want it to look. It's a measure of patience. Bit of a marathon rather than a race, you know? Marathon rather than a sprint. Okay. So, I think a bit more ice yellow would not go amiss on the brighter spots. So this is undiluted, unmixed ice yellow, just really on the apex points of the robe. the very topmost parts of these folds where the knee would be on the miniature, assuming this guy was human and still has human anatomy. Underneath his weird robes, which he seems to have, to be fair. Clean up that little bit around his sash. And then one of the last few areas that I want to do is to brighten up the blue in the same way that we did the burgundy. So that's Thalasar blue mixed with a little bit of the silver gray to create a highlight, as you can see in the top. So just a little bit where it's needed. And if we end up going a little bit overboard with this, it's okay. We can come back in and we can clean up with more Thalasar blue. But so far, I'm liking the way that's looking. So when it comes to applying highlights, I kind of like to break it into two different areas, right? First of all, there's the color that we've picked. It needs to be the right level of brightness and that right point on the spectrum that it blends into the adjacent color without being too eye-catching, so to speak. So the way the color integrates with existing colors, essentially, existing shades of blue, for example, in this case, that's part of it. And then after that, there's also the shape of the actual highlight. So when you apply a highlight, if you're going to apply just a big chunky square highlight, it's not going to blend, essentially. But if you get good at painting a kind of teardrop shape, I think that has more chance of blending into adjacent areas. So get used to painting, I guess, what I would call spindle shapes, like that. Highlights that are kind of this shape, that kind of taper at the end, for example, and that has a better chance of blending into the surface of the miniature seamlessly, simply because our eyes struggle a little bit to pick up the ends, and therefore it can appear to blend into the surface. So likewise for here, you apply the highlight here in the center, and then you kind of feather it up on either side to taper them, taper the ends, like so. And that helps them blend into the surface more effectively. The other thing you can do is to, if it's not blending in, sometimes the solution is not to lessen the amount of highlight, but to really go up one color by adding more of your brightening color. In this case, it's still the silver gray, to mix a lighter highlight and leaning into it rather than necessarily scaling back the amount of surface area covered. It's about increasing the brightness. And then when you apply the brighter highlight, you cover less and less of it. And that can have a really good effect as well. And this is what you can do to go back and forth over and over until you're happy with the look. Right? Yes, I am rapidly reaching the point of right now. So I want to just touch up that little bit of silver that I got into the gold, unfortunately, over here. Bit of silver over the front, and then put a pair of specs into his eyes, like so. Clean it up with a bit of Black Templar. And this is setting us up to have a nice glowy look. A bit of black. Trim that. A little bit too much if I'm to be honest. Okay, let's try it. Let's start over. Let's take as much of that black out again. And then let's go back in. Something like that. Just dry that off slightly. Give it a good shake. And then build up the cheek back into it. Again, this is one of those moments where the model's only done when you say it is. It requires a bit of patience to get right. A bit more of the white again. You can see why I call this a dance, right? Because sometimes it just takes going back and forth a little bit. And coming back in, hopefully for the last time. There we go. That works. Okay. A bit more detail in his face. And that's looking good. Okay, so we're going to come in with some Mantis green. Mantis Warriors green. Here we go. And just put a tiny amount of that into his eyes, onto the gems. On his armor. Well, on his staff rather. So there. On the sides. And onto his eyes. It's going to look a bit subtle, but I think that's okay. And then I'm going to grab a tiny amount of ice blue, well, ice yellow. Not sure where the blue came from. Put it on here, just as a point highlight. And again, the same on his eyes. Trust me, the desire to not touch his eyes again is legendary. But sometimes you just gotta do it. You gotta bite the bullet. And even though it's hard, I think the end result is well worth the effort. A bit more green on the one just below his chest, or just above his chest. And a bit of silver to brighten up the edge. And there we go. Champion of Zinj from the 1980s. Well, hope you enjoyed this one, guys. More to come, as always. Stay tuned, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Happy painting.